welcome to the Marley Bird Garter Stitch Shawl Knit Along, sponsored by Red Heart. I'm Marley Bird, proud spokesperson for Red Heart Yarns. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do section 3 of the Garter Stitch Shawl. This section is comprised of the seed stitch. Now, don't be alarmed. Don't automatically think, all right, that's it. I'm out. I'm not going to do this anymore. I don't like seed stitch. I'm going to show you some little tips and tricks I use to keep on track with my seed stitch, and I'm also going to show you some different increases that you're going to use to help you again maintain your seed stitch pattern throughout the entire pattern. Now, if you've been following along with this knit along, you know that so far you have learned a lot of different things. This has been a really great skill builder project. In the first section, you did garter stitch, stripes, and color blocks, right? So we did garter stitch by knitting every row. We did knit front and back increases, and we also did blocks of color. So there were times that you had to change color to go from color A or B or C or so on and so forth. You learned a whole lot. You also learned how to use stitch markers to really help you keep track where you are. In section 2, I continued on doing the color changes, but we changed the rate at which you do them. So we changed colors every 2 rows for section 2. We also carried the yarn up along the side for a majority of the section, so you learned how to carry the yarn up the side. We continued doing our increases with the knit front and back. And then we also introduced a row of purls. So that way you could see how changing just one simple row in a 4-row repeat into purls can create a really distinctly different look. So you got garter ridge coupled with a stockinette section. So you got a lot of texture. And then when we changed those colors for the garter stitch versus the stockinette, man, that gave a lot of depth to your shawl, right? Isn't that exciting? The really great thing is that it didn't matter what color you chose to use where in all reality. Of course, you all are probably trying to follow along with the pattern and use color A when you wanted to do color A, or color B when it was time to use color B, so on and so forth. The truth of the matter is, the way this shawl is designed, you could have mixed and matched all of those colors and really gotten something just as super unique as the original. So it doesn't really matter where or when you use the colors, with the exception of whenever you use color B, I really like to maintain that throughout. So you could have flip-flopped color A and C whenever you wanted. But if we kept B consistent all the way throughout, I think that gives the shawl some sort of, I don't know if symmetry is the right word or what it is, but I just think it really kind of pulls it all together and it makes it look really cool. If you've also been following along and you know that there is a Facebook group available for this knit along, it is so much fun and such a joy to see all of the wonderful shawls getting made and all of the excitement from everybody from everyone who is making the shawl. Whether it's a beginner or an advanced beginner or an experienced knitter, everybody is having a good time. So I want to say congratulations to all of you who are part of the knit along, and thank you for coming along this journey with me. Why don't we go ahead and take a look at what you've completed so far, and then we can take a look at what we're going to work on today. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pull up the shawl that we've been using all along as our example, and I'm going to set it down. Let's take a look down here. As you look down here, once again, you can see this was section 1, or the garter stitch shawl, or the garter section with the color blocks, right? So we have these really great color blocks. When I completed this section in the shawl, I wanted to move on, and I wanted to do something with a little bit more color work, more striping, but I wanted it to be something a little bit more advanced than just garter stitch, which is why I introduced the 1 row of purls, which gave us this really excellent stockinette stitch in between these garter ridges, right? Doesn't that look lovely? I'm sure all of you who have completed your shawl out there, you're looking at your shawl, you're like, oh my gosh, this is just so sneaking pretty. Because it is, it's so pretty. It doesn't matter what color combination you've used, it looks really cool. Once you finished section 2, which was comprised of 3 mini sections, you finished off with 2 rows of your color B in the garter stitch, okay? And that's where we begin. So we're going to move this up once more. And we are right here on this section, you guys. We are on this seed stitch section. Now, seed stitch is comprised of alternating your knits and your purls. Okay, so you're going to alternate knit and purl down the row, But then on the next row, you're going to knit your pearls and purl your knits. So you're going to do the opposite. I like to think of it as a checkerboard. If you think of your checkerboard as the red blocks as your knits and the black blocks as your pearls, you can see a checkerboard goes red, black, red, black, red, black, down a row, down the column. Let's call it a column. And that's what you're going to get with the seed stitch. You're going to get a knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl down the column. You're also going to get that along the row because it's going to go knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. And on top of this purl, it's going to go knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. It's going to be really cool. You get a really cool boxed effect. You can see down here, that's exactly what we have here. The reason I chose to use seed stitch for this particular section, again, goes along with the whole idea that this is a teaching shawl. I really liked, one, that this particular stitch gives a great deal of texture to the shawl, and I feel like it just, not that it necessarily adds weight, but for me, I guess it feels like it adds a little bit of weight. It gives it something at the bottom of the shawl. I also wanted you to realize that if we introduce pearls and knits together within the same row, we can get a completely different look. Now, of course, if you have knits and pearls within the same row, and on the next row you stack the knits on top of the knits and the pearls on top of the pearls, you get ribbing. And what happens when we do ribbing? It cinches together, right? That's not exactly the look we're going for at the bottom of a shawl. We don't want this really big, beautiful shawl and then have it cinched together at the bottom. I don't really like that look. That's why I decided to use the seed stitch, because I could get that knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. But on the row back, you are going to do the opposite of whatever the stitch is, which goes into my, I think I'm on number 3, number 3 teaching tool. You're going to learn to read your knitting even more. It's going to be very important until you get used to the seed stitch and into a rhythm that you're able to look at your stitches and say, okay, that's a purl, which means I'm going to knit it, and that's a knit, which means I'm going to purl it. You're going to be able to quickly understand and not get lost in your pattern if you're able to read your stitches. So I felt like this was a great time for you to jump in a little bit more in depth in your knitting and begin to read your stitches even more. Now you'll also notice as we look down here that the seed stitch section is not that big, right? This section is only as big as one mini section from section 2, which is fantastic. The hard part is that you also have more stitches down here. So even though it's really small, there are a lot of stitches. So it's going to take you a long time to get down and back through a row. No problem. We are not in a race. You can complete this at your own pace. And I encourage you actually not to hurry so that way you don't accidentally make mistakes. Take your time, read your stitches, and do the knits and purls the way they're supposed to be. Now, I'm going to start off this lesson by showing you how to do an actual seed stitch on a swatch, okay? And then we will jump into how to do the increases and why I chose the increases I chose for this pattern. And then I'm going to show you how to recognize and fix mistakes, okay? So there's 3 big sections in this entire video. It's going to take a little while. Don't worry. I have timestamps down at the very bottom in the video description. So if you need to jump back and forth to sections depending on where you are, you can absolutely do that. While you're down there looking at the video description, why don't you go ahead and take this moment to smash that like button, as my kids say, because I know all of you are enjoying this knit along, and this is a great time for you to go ahead, hit that like button on YouTube and let everybody else know that this is a really great teaching shawl, and it's a lot of fun to wear, okay? Deal? Sweet. So let's go ahead. I'm going to have you guys follow along with me. Grab a pair of needles and some waste yarn and cast on 10 stitches or 11 stitches, your choice. And let's go ahead and work in some seed stitch together before we work on the shawl, okay? I'm going to show you how to do seed stitch. Let's go. Okay, so let's learn how to do a little seed stitch before we jump in on the actual shawl. What do you say? Let's take a look down here. I've gone ahead and I've worked up a swatch of seed stitch so that you can see what it's supposed to look like. And you can tell right here that it's a combination of knits and purls, and as they stack on top of each other, they alternate, which gives this really great texture. Even if I turn it on its side, can you see how you get all of that really awesome texture? It's so beautiful. Now, when you're doing a seed stitch, it's important to recognize what the stitch is prior to you working into it, because that will give you a clue on what the stitch needs to be now. I'm going to show you how to do this holding the yarn in both English and Continental so that you can see both ways. Now, as I'm looking at my swatch here, I've already got some seed stitch happening. If you've just done a cast on, you haven't done anything else, don't worry about it. I want you to go ahead, I want you to start off with a knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, all the way down your row. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I can look on here and I'm already looking at a purl, which means I'm going to knit. So I'm going to go into the stitch and I'm going to knit it. I need to hold my yarn better so that I have better consistency. I'm looking at my next stitch and it's a knit stitch, right? As it's resting on my left-hand needle, which means I'm going to purl. So I want to make sure I bring my yarn between my needles, go into the stitch and purl it. It is very important you go between your needles. I'm looking at a purl stitch as my next stitch on my left-hand needle, which means I'm going to do the opposite, so I'm going to knit it. So I bring my yarn between my needles and I knit it. You see how there's a rhythm here? I'm looking at a knit stitch and I can tell it's a knit stitch because see, there's a V right there. There's no bump immediately underneath my needle. So I know that that's a knit, which means I need to purl it. So I'm going to bring my yarn between my needles and I'm going to purl it. I'm looking at a purl and I know that because there's the bump. So I go between my needles and I knit. I'm looking at a knit, I go between my needles and I purl. Now, as your pattern is established and you get going along, you will find you won't have to read your stitches over here all the time. You won't have to look and say, oh, that's a knit stitch, I need to purl it, or oh, that's a purl stitch, I need to knit it. You'll get in a rhythm of a knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. And it's really great when you hit that rhythm. What makes it not so great is when you're in a rhythm but you accidentally did like 2 knits in a row or 2 purls in a row, because then that throws everything off. Not to worry though, it's something that you can absolutely fix, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But I want to point out that it's not that you are always going to have to read your stitches over there, but it's going to be helpful if you know how to do it. So I'm going to do that one more time, and so I'm just rotating it around so that I can work in the other way, and I'm going to hold the yarn in my left hand this time. I'm looking at a purl bump, which means I'm going to knit that first stitch. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to knit it. I'm looking at a knit stitch, which means I'm going to purl. So I'm going to purl. Now, the number of stitches I have on here makes it so that I'm actually beginning with the knit stitch every single row, but that's not always the case, okay? Depending on the number of stitches you have on your needles, you will either knit the first stitch or purl the first stitch. It all depends on where it all ends up. So that's where it's really important. If you are able to go ahead and read your stitch, you don't have to really overthink it. If you're looking at a purl, you knit it. If you're looking at a knit, you purl it. Now I just finished that row holding the yarn in my left hand, and you can see I'm keeping the sequence really nice and neat, correct? It's not so difficult. Let's do that one more time. I want you guys to get a really good look at what the seed stitch looks like. I'm looking at a purl, which means I'm going to do the opposite, which means I'm going to knit. So I'm going to go ahead and I knit this one. Then I have to purl the next one. So I go between my needles and I purl. I see a purl, which means I'm going to knit. I go between my needles and I knit. Now I'm going to show you what happens if you forget to go between your needles, okay? This next stitch is a knit, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to purl it, but I'm not going to move my yarn. I'm going to leave my yarn in back, and I'm going to show you what it looks like, okay? So I'm going into the stitch and I'm going to purl. And I'm looking at a purl, which means I need to knit, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to move my yarn. I'm looking at a knit, which means I have to purl, so I'm going to move my yarn. And let's say on this next one, I forget to move my yarn once again, and it needs to be a knit, so I go in to knit it. I forget to move my yarn, and I'm like, all right, ooh, I'm in a rhythm. I'm going really good. This is so easy. Geez, what's Marley talking about? Seed stitch is hard. Psh, this is crazy. I've got this. It's no problem. You get to the end of the row, you're given all sorts of confidence, and you get done your look, and you're like, what is that? What happened right there? Those don't look right. And oh my gosh, I have extra stitches. How do I have extra stitches? I did my knit, purl all the way along. What is going on? Well, what happened is these little loops right here that are resting on the needle, see how that just is resting right there? Those are accidental yarn overs. When you forget to move your yarn from back to front between your needles, or vice versa, from front to back between your needles, going from a knit to a purl, you accidentally lay the yarn over top of your needle, which gives you the look of an extra stitch. Now, these are things that can be totally fixed. If you have one or two within your row, we're just going to go to those stitches and we're going to let them fall off our needle. It's all going to be okay. Yes, it's going to add a little bit of extra slack to the row below, but once your shawl is complete and it's washed and blocked, or you wear it for a while, all the stitches sort of work into place and you won't ever notice it. If you have several of these yarn overs throughout the row, and when I say several, I mean like 5, 6, 7, 8, once you start dropping your stitches off for that many, it's really going to be noticeable on the row below. So in a situation like that, it's going to be important that you go ahead and tink. And don't worry, there's a whole video on tinking right here on the Marley Bird YouTube channel. And those of you who don't know, tink is knit spelled backwards. So you're going to unknit your work. Now, let's take a look at these and see how to handle these accidental yarn overs. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn my work. So I'm still working the next row. I'm not doing anything different. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work over to where those mistakes are. So I'm looking at a purl, which means I'm going to knit, and I'm going to just carry on in my pattern, working across to where I can see the mistake. Maybe I didn't see the mistake until now when I'm coming up to it, okay? I'm like, oh, okay, what's going on? What is happening right there? What is that? It looks like it's just a string resting on my needle, right? That's because that's exactly what it is. It's the string that I accidentally had when I went to knit my next stitch and my yarn was in front. It rested right on top of my needle. So instead of knitting into that stitch or knitting it together with the next stitch, I literally just want it to fall off. So I am just going to take that stitch. Look, I'm letting it fall off my left-hand needle. It just goes away. See how it just goes away? No harm, no foul. If I were to have knit it, I would have gotten a big hole, and I don't want a hole. So just let it fall off, it goes away. I carry on in my pattern, which means I have to purl the next stitch, knit the next stitch, purl the next stitch, and I can see, oh, what is that? Well, that's another yarn over. This one was created when I had my yarn in back and I went to purl, and my yarn went over top of my needle so that I could purl. So once again, I just let that yarn fall off my needle and it disappears. It goes away. I don't ever have to worry about it. Carry on in my pattern and I finish up my row. Now let's take a look at what this looks like. I'm going to set this down. Now we can see here in the two areas where I dropped the yarn, it is a little bit big. It looks sort of like a hole, but it's not a hole. The reason it's bigger is because that yarn, as it was laying over top of that needle, that is the yarn that went from this stitch to that stitch. So now that I've dropped it off, it just makes those two stitches a little bit wider. Don't worry, all of this will wash out, so to speak. It will all work its way out and be just fine until the end of the piece, okay? So that's how you will deal with accidental yarn overs. Now, what if we accidentally do the wrong stitch? And so instead of a knit, we make a purl or vice versa. Now I'm going to show you how to do that next, okay? So you know the seed stitch and you've been going along, you're feeling really confident and you're just like, oh my gosh, I got this. I've been doing my knit one and my purl one. I don't even have to read my stitches anymore. You finish your row, you put it down and you notice this. Oh my gosh, what happened right there? Why do all of a sudden I have a row of knit stitches among my sea of seed stitches? What did I do wrong? Well, I'm sorry to say that at some point in time down here in these rows, you accidentally did either 2 knits or 2 purls side by side, and so it threw you off a little bit. Eventually you got back on track and everything was good to go, but now we've got to go back and we've got to fix this mistake. That does not require us to go back and tink, which is knit spelled backwards, and if you don't know how to tink, you can find videos right here on the Marley Bird YouTube channel, as I said before. But what we're going to do is we're going to work over to where this mistake stitch is, and we're going to purposely drop this stitch off of our needle so that it ladders down, and then we're going to pick it up with the crochet hook and have it climb back up the ladder with the correct stitches. So let me show you how to do that. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work over to that stitch, okay? You could just slide stitches over and get over to that stitch and work it, but as we are working on our shawl, that's kind of unrealistic, so that's why I want you to work over to where the mistake is. So make note of where your mistake is, and we're going to work over to that. So I'm going to maintain my seed stitch pattern, and I'm going to work over to the mistake, all right? When I get to the mistake, there I am, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to let go of my right hand needle so that the stitches don't fall off. I'm going to have it just go away. And I'm going to deal with this stitch right there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let that stitch fall off of my left hand needle. Oh my gosh, don't panic. It's okay. We can take care of this. I'm grabbing a crochet hook that is at least the same size as the needle I'm using, if not a size or 2 smaller. I wouldn't go much smaller than that, and I would not go bigger than the needle size you're using. So use a crochet hook that's about the same size. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull the strands of yarn out of this loop, okay? What I'm doing is undoing that particular stitch so that I can get down to where I know the stitch is correct and it's time to fix it. I drop the stitch down to where I can see there's a purl. So I know that all of my stitches are absolutely correct up to this point, and I can see this purl bump. I'm going to take my hook and I'm placing it right into that stitch so now it doesn't go anywhere. And I'm going to adjust my right hand to make everything in the position I want it to be. So let me show you what that means. All of these runs that have come out of this stitch are all right here. Now, what are those? What are all those loose loops? That string right there connects that stitch to that stitch, and it fell out of this stitch. Meaning, as this stitch fell down the ladder, when we go to climb back up the ladder and we pull this run through this stitch, it's going to tighten everything up and it's going to create a stitch again. So we're essentially climbing the ladder. Now the important thing here is, where are these runs supposed to be as we create a purl and we create a knit, okay? When we knit, our yarn is behind our needles. When we purl, our yarn is in front of our needles. The same thing goes for the runs in the ladder. If we want this stitch to be a purl, it has to be in front of the needle. If we want that stitch to be a knit, it needs to be behind the stitch on the needle, okay, or on the hook. So right here, knowing that our seed stitch sequence requires that on top of a purl, we have to put a knit, I'm going to, you can see here I have my forefinger from my right hand or my left hand behind my work here, and I'm just have all of the runs kind of laid out so that way I can make sure I go in order. And this bottommost run, I want it behind this stitch because I'm going to make this stitch a knit stitch. The reason I'm making it a knit stitch is because right now it's a purl. See that purl bump? So to make that a knit stitch, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my crochet hook, I'm going to go underneath that run, grab it with my hook, and pull it right through my stitch. See how easy that is? Now I've created a knit stitch. Now, following along in my sequence, I know that my next stitch has to be a purl. Now, when we purl, our yarn is in front, which means this run has to be in front of this stitch. So to do that, what I like to do is I will pinch my stitch, remove my hook, take the next run, put it in front of that stitch, take my hook, put it back in, so I'm in place, okay? Now I have to check and make sure that my stitch isn't twisted. And if I look, oh gosh, it is. Can you see that? See how the bottom legs of my stitch are twisted? I don't want that. So all I do is I remove my hook and reinsert it so that the legs are not twisted together. See how they're not twisted anymore? Now I take my hook, go into that loop or the run that I put in front, grab it and pull it through. And I have a purl bump. Now the next stitch needs to be a knit, so I'm going to readjust my hook. I'm going to take it out so I can put it in this way. Make sure it's not twisted. It's not. Grab the next bottommost run. I'm going underneath it and pulling it through. The next stitch needs to be a purl, so I'm going to remove my hook, grab the next run, put it in front, put my hook back in, check and see if it's twisted. It is. So I'm going to take it out, reinsert it. Now I grab the run and pull it through. Next one needs to be a knit, so I adjust my hook. My run is in back, which is great because I want it to be a knit stitch. Grab the run and pull it up. Now that the stitch has been pulled all the way up and it's in position to where it needs to be, I need to decide, do I put that stitch on my right hand needle or my left hand needle? Well, here's a little trick to know. Your working yarn is always attached to the yarn that's on your right hand needle, unless you're doing a stitch pattern that requires you to slip stitches, which this one does not, correct? So that lets me know that this stitch does not have my working yarn attached to it. So it needs to go back onto my left hand needle. And when I put it back on my left hand needle, I want to make sure that the orientation of the stitch is like so, where the front leg is ahead of the back leg. Now I can carry on in my established pattern of seed stitch, and I've corrected that stitch. So I can go ahead and do my purl, knit, all the way down the row. Pretty cool, huh? So you don't have to rip out a whole bunch of stitches to correct a little stitch like that. Now, more often than not, it will happen that if you have one incorrect stitch, you'll have like 3 or 4 side by side. Don't worry, just take each one at a time, drop it down and correct it all the way up, and you have it fixed. Now that we know how to do seed stitch and we know how to recognize an accidental yarn over, know how to fix mistakes if we accidentally get off stitch pattern, I want to talk to you now about increases. So we're going to talk about the increases and how I've changed them up for this part of the shawl. Our entire shawl has been worked up doing increases along the wingspan and the center spine. And we're going to continue doing that, but we're going to change the type of increases we're using. This whole time we've been using a knit front and back because I like that increase. I think it's pretty. It's not a yarn over, it's not a make one. It's something really rather simple, and it just is just nice. Well, now that we're working into a seed stitch pattern, which requires us to maintain a sequence of stitches along the row, I chose to change up the increase so that way your increase will allow you to automatically flow into the seed stitch pattern. Meaning, we're going to start off with a knit one and purl one into the same stitch. If you're looking at your instructions, you'll see that it has parentheses and it says K1, P1, and then it has a parenthesis. So the parentheses is around those 2 stitches. What that means is we're going to do a knit one and a purl one into the same stitch, and not through the back leg. We're going to do them both into the front leg. All right, I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. On the opposite side of the coin, or the opposite side of the shawl, when we get down to the end, we're going to finish with a purl one and knit one into the same leg of 1 stitch. That's going to be our increase. We're going to work 2 stitches into 1 stitch, okay, so that we get our increase. What that is going to do is it's going to allow us to go from a knit one, purl one into the same stitch and jump into our knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one pattern for the seed stitch. And we will end with our purl one, knit one. Do you see how that works? It's just a way for us to maintain our stitch pattern from beginning to the end. Now, let me go ahead and show you how to do the knit one, purl one, and how to do the purl one, knit one into the same stitch. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to show you on the swatch I've been using all along. Now, obviously, you're not going to do these increases side by side the whole way like I'm going to show you right now. This is purely just to show you how to do these increases, okay? So I'm going to start off with the knit one, purl one into the same stitch. So I'm going to go into the stitch and knit it. I'm not going to let it drop off my needle. I'm going to move my yarn between my needles. So now it's in front, ready to purl. I'm going to go into the stitch and purl it and off. So I have 2 stitches where there was 1. Let me show you that one more time. I'm going to go in and knit, bring my yarn between my needles, and then go into the same leg and purl. I'm going to show you again. I'm going to go in and knit, bring my yarn between my needles, go into the same leg and purl. I'm going to show you that with the yarn in my other hand. I'm going to go in and knit, bring my yarn between my needles, go into the same leg and purl. Show you again. I'm going to go in and knit, bring my yarn between my needles, go into the same leg of that same stitch and purl. Pretty simple, right? Now, let's go ahead and learn how to do the purl one and knit one. It's the same process. We're still going to use 1 stitch and we're going to use the front leg. We just have to remember to move our yarn from front to back, okay? So I'm going to go into the next stitch. I'm going to purl it, bring my yarn between my needles, and knit it into that same leg. Let's do that again. I'm going to go into the stitch and purl, bring my yarn between my needles, and knit into the same leg. Show you that one more time with the yarn in my right hand. I'm going to go into the stitch and purl it, between my needles, go into the stitch and knit it. I'm going to show you that now with the yarn in my left hand. Same movement, just yarn in different hand. Go into the stitch and purl it, bring my yarn between my needles, and then knit it. Go into the stitch and purl it, bring my yarn between my needles, and knit it. Last one, go into the stitch and purl, yarn between my needles, and knit. Seems awkward, but it works. Look down here, I'm going to show you. Yes, I've increased all the stitches down this row, but if you notice, I have a knit and a purl, a knit and a purl, a knit and a purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, and then I have a purl and a knit, 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 purl and a knit, purl and a knit. Why is it that I changed up the sequence? Why didn't I just do a knit front and back and a purl front and back? The reason is this. When you do a purl front and back, you still get 2 purls. We don't end up with a purl one and a knit one. Yes, when we do a knit front and back, we get a knit and a purl, correct? Super awesome. But when we do a purl front and back, we still get 2 purls. That's why it's so important that we do a purl one and a knit one in the same leg so that we get that purl stitch and an actual knit stitch to maintain our seed stitch sequence. So, of course, there are other increases out there we could have chosen. I could have done a make one. I could have done a yarn over. I could have done all sorts of different things. I chose this particular increase because it's the closest one to the increase that you have been using all along. This increase should not get you all flummoxed and out of control, okay? It's something you should absolutely be able to do. And it will help you maintain your stitch pattern easier. Every stitch in your row is going to be a knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, and the opposite on the next row. It's going to be really easy to follow along. Just trust me on this. Once you understand how to do this increase, it's super easy. Now, the other change with this increase is no longer is it that we knit 1 stitch and then work our increase on the outside edges. We're going to do our increase in the very first stitch and the very last stitch of every row. Let me say that one more time. The very first stitch and the very last stitch of every row is going to be an increase. What kind of increase? That is going to be written in your instructions. The tech editor and I that I worked with, we chose to write out the instructions for rows 1 through 8. And it's very precise. It tells you precisely what stitch you're going to begin with, what stitches you're going to work till you get to your stitch marker or the stitch before your stitch marker, and then so on and so forth. As long as you keep track of the rows you're on in your 8 row sequence, you're going to be just fine with this. don't stress out too much, okay? Honestly, you know how to read your stitches, you know how to fix the mistakes. It's going to turn out just fine. So this is what I'm gonna do now. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna pull in the shawl I've been working on, and I'm gonna work through 2 rows on my shawl with you so you can see how this works up. I'm also gonna show you a little tip of something that I did on my sample shawl to help me keep track of what rows I was on. You know what I mean. All right, so I'm gonna grab my shawl and I'm gonna show you how to do that, okay? Here we go. Check this out. I am just as far along as you guys are. It's pretty darn great. Actually, my section 3 is nearly complete, so I guess I'm a little bit further along. But do you notice one thing that's a little bit different from this shawl and the shawls that are behind me? You'll notice I chose to use color A in this section. The reason I chose to use color A is because, one, I had an extra ball of color A and I was like, you know what? I think that'll be mighty pretty. So I'm pointing that out to say, if you want to use color A for section 3 or color C for section 3, totally your prerogative. You can choose either one. It's going to be just as lovely. I actually really like the way this looks. Now I have worked up my rows 1 through 16. And then I did 1 through 8 twice, so I have 16 rows, plus the 2 extra rows that are written in the pattern, because the instructions state you'll do rows 1 through 8, repeat that again, so you'll do 1 through 8 again, and then you'll do rows 1 and 2. And then you'll switch colors and do rows 3 and 4. So that's where I am in the pattern. I'm on row 3. Now, as we look down here, I'm going to point something out. You'll notice that I have a stitch marker here, right? I already told you to remove your stitch markers, correct? Absolutely, that's what I wanted you to do. I added a stitch marker to my own work to help me keep track of what row I was on. So I did not write this in the pattern. This is a benefit to all of you who are watching this video and have carried on this long until this point of the video, so you can see why I put that stitch marker there. What happened is when I did my very first increase, when I did my very first knit 1 and purl 1 into the same stitch, I put a marker between those 2 stitches. So I did knit 1, put a marker, purl 1. The reason I did that is then I didn't move my marker at all. I kept it there. And so every time I increased on that outside edge, that outside stitch, it let me see how many rows I had completed. So I put my knit 1, marker, purl 1. So that was my first row. The next row, when I came back, I had an increase out there, and so I increased into that stitch, so that gave me 2 stitches outside the marker. And then when I came back, I had 3 stitches outside the marker, and come back, I have 4 stitches outside the marker. See how this works out? So for me, instead of having to count my stitches to remember what row I was on, by placing that marker between my very first increase, so it was knit 1, put my marker, purl 1, and all of that was in the same stitch, I was able to have a way of counting how many rows I had worked up already. Does that make sense? If it does not make sense, don't worry. It is not something you have to do. It is not something I wrote in the pattern. It's purely something I did on my pattern, on my piece, my shawl, to help me keep track, and I'm giving you that information in case you want to do it too. So here I am. It's time for me to add in my color B, which is the orange color, if you remember. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to start off here, and I'm not even going to, yeah, I am. I'm going to tie it on just like I've done before because I find that the easiest. It doesn't flop around on me, and I just really like that. So there it is. It's tied on. I'm going to push that up, and I'm going to jump in and begin. There's a lot of stitches on here, okay? I am on, as I said, I'm on row 3 of my seed stitch section. So I'm going to begin with my knit 1 and purl 1, okay? So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to knit the stitch, bring my yarn between my needles, and purl the stitch. And now I can carry on in pattern. I just did my purl, and I can see right here, I'm looking at a purl. I know it's probably hard to see with the white on white, but I'm looking at a purl so I can jump into my knit. And then I can carry on in my pattern. See how that works out? So I started off with my knit one, purl one, and I'm able to automatically just jump into my pattern sequence. So technically, I don't even have to really look at my row 3 instructions because I know that when I get down to 1 stitch before my marker, it's going to be time to increase. And I will know what the increase is, whether it's a purl one, knit one, or a knit one, purl one, because whichever stitch the next stitch is supposed to be, that will give me my clue. I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Let me go ahead and get down to 1 stitch before my center marker. All right, so I'm getting down here to the last couple stitches before my stitch marker, and I'm going to go ahead and work my, let's see, that's a knit. This is a purl, which means my next stitch would be a knit, right? So without even looking at my row 3 instructions, I can already tell you that this is supposed to be a knit one and purl one into the same stitch. So let me look at my instructions. Row 3, 1 stitch before the marker, knit one and purl one to the next stitch. How do I know that? Because my increase is helping me maintain my stitch pattern sequence. So if I just did a purl, I know that my next stitch is supposed to be a knit, and because it's an increase, I'm going to also do a purl into that same stitch. Slip my marker, knit my middle stitch, slip my marker, and now over here I'm going to do the opposite because remember our sides are symmetrical. So on this side I know I'm going to begin with a purl one and then knit one, and I'm going to carry on, and it puts me simple into my sequence, and that's exactly where I am. Now I'm going to show you another little trick here. I'm going to tink this back, and I'm going to show you a simple little trick here that's really cool, okay? If you're ever in doubt on what the stitch should be as you're starting a row, if you're looking at a purl, you're going to start off with a purl one and a knit one. If you're looking at a knit, you're going to start off with a knit one and a purl one. Now that works at the beginning of the row. So this is like the beginning. So I'm after my stitch marker. So I'm looking at a purl. That means I'm going to do my purl one and I'm going to do my knit one all into the same stitch. And then I'm able to jump into the sequence. And when I get to the end of the row, my little clue is that whatever my next stitch should be, so if it's supposed to be a purl, it would be a purl one, knit one. If it's supposed to be a knit, it would be a knit one, purl one. Does that make sense? So at the start of my row, if I'm looking at a purl, I'm going to start off with a purl one, knit one. If I'm looking at a knit, I'm going to start off with a knit one, purl one. Does that help? If it doesn't help, don't worry, just disregard it. I have said so many different things in so many different ways. One of those ways should hopefully work for you. If just keeping track of row for row where you are and following along in the instructions really helps you, fantastic. If you like the little tidbits of information I have where it's put a stitch marker out here to help you keep track of how many rows you're on, and then the first stitch of like the sequence, if it's a purl, you'll start off with the purl one, knit one. If it's a knit, you'll start off with a knit one, purl one, and then you'll end with whatever the next sequence, the stitch in the sequence is. You know, all of this is all out there just to help you maintain, okay? So regardless, if all the little extra tidbits or tricks that I use don't work for you, totally fine. You can absolutely just follow along with your pattern as normal. Now for this particular shawl, all I would do here is continue on in my pattern down to the very end, and I would end this particular row with a purl one, knit one into the last stitch, and I would turn and begin my row 4. That's it, you guys. That is section 3. Now I will reiterate, this section is nice and small, but it has a lot of stitches in it, okay? It just seems like it takes forever at one point when you're going down the row, especially as you're having to move the yarn from the knit stitch with the yarn in back to a purl stitch with the yarn in front. Don't forget to move your yarn between the needles for each and every stitch, okay? And then remember, you're stacking knits on top of purls and purls on top of knits. So it's going to be the opposite. As long as you keep track of all those things, you're going to have no problem with this section. I believe in you. I know each and every one of you can complete this shawl. It might take some of you a little bit longer than others, but that's okay because we're not in a race. We're in this to learn some wonderful techniques, have a great community to work with each other and encourage each other. And at the end, you're going to have a shawl that you're going to be so proud of, and you're going to say, I learned how to make that with Marley Bird on the Marley Bird YouTube channel, right? I know that's what you're going to say, right? I'm pretty sure. All right, everybody, go finish your section 3. Next week, I will show you how to do the applied I-cord, and I'm going to show you how to weave in your ends. So all of that wraps up the entire knit along. Can you believe it? I can't believe it's already going to be over soon. That's all right. You are more than halfway done with your shawl. Finish this section, whether you use color A or color C, it really doesn't matter. Your choice. Use whatever yarn you choose to use, and make sure that you post about it in the Facebook group, on Instagram, Twitter, whatever it may be. Use the hashtag Marley's Shawl Cal, so that way I can see what you're posting and see your progress. I'm so excited about all of these shawls. All right, I'm Marley Bird, and this is the Marley Bird Garter Stitch Shawl Knit Along, sponsored by Red Heart. And I'm the spokesperson for Red Heart. Super cool. Smash that like button. Bye, guys.